Hello everyone, welcome to the Little Horn episode. We're in part 6 today, and today is probably going to be the final episode in this little 6-part series. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please review and go back over the other 5 videos to sort of give you a nice overview of this entire passage. The question or questions we're going to look at today is what or who is the little horn if we go by an interpretation that says it happened in the past, either close to Daniel's time, in the distant future of Daniel, or within the lifetime of Christ, or the lifetime of Paul, basically in the first century. And then I also want to come back to one of the questions I haven't answered yet, which is, what is the clay, the feet of clay, from the statue man in chapter 2? Now, let's go straight into it then and ask the question, regarding the little horn. There are 2 interpretations I want to share with you today. Now, the most common view is that the statue man and the 4 beasts represent in chronological order the empires that came after Daniel's time. We have Babylon first. We know for a fact that the head of gold is Babylon because Daniel says, "You, king, are the head of gold." So we've got that as a starting ground, no matter what interpretation we go for. Then the traditional view is then we have Medo-Persia as one. Then we have Greece, and then we have the Roman Empire. Now, the legs of iron are the Roman Empire. So what would the feet be? Now, the clay. The clay is a very interesting phrase. Now, one possibility is that the clay represents Israel. There are a couple of references in the Old Testament where the writer describes Israel as being the clay, which is molded and formed by the potter, God. Isaiah 29:16, Isaiah 64 verse 8, Jeremiah chapter 18 verses 1 to 9. And also in the New Testament, Paul would reflect on this in Romans chapter 9 verses 14 to 24. So if Israel would be the clay, some have suggested that the 10 toes now, or the feet in general, represent that sort of period when the Roman Empire were in power, and Israel sort of, I suppose they were not the dominant power, but they certainly had some existence and some authority. Now that interpretation would make sense because the rock comes down and smashes the feet. Bear that in mind. It's the feet that the rock smashes, and then it says all those other pieces of metal sort of dissolved into the wind. And even though those empires had already been destroyed, I suppose the idea is that Christ brings down the kingdom of God onto earth, and that it's very different to any kind of earthly empire. It doesn't rule with violence, terror, and great authority. It has a different kind of authority. It has a divine authority. It has it is a kingdom rather than an empire. Now, what would the little horn be in that regard then? Because we know in Daniel chapter 7, 10 horns represent the 10 toes, and then the little horn rises out of them, destroys 3 of them. Well, many have suggested then that the little horn would be Jewish. Either, I don't know about a person, but it would sort of represent a Jewish force that persecuted the Christians, the saints. Now, the time and half a time there, which is 3.5 years, could very well refer to the timeline of Jesus, if you took it in a literal sense in that way. So that is one possibility. The clay and iron is the period when the Romans ruled over Israel, and the little horn is Jewish. All right, something else that you would have to consider with this interpretation, or something that we can investigate with this interpretation, would be to look at Paul's words. Now, obviously, when Paul talks about the man of sin in 2 Thessalonians, he would have in mind the little horn passage there, because it talks about he has eyes like a man speaking boastful things against the Most High. One of the things that people point out is that Paul was writing during the time of the Roman Empire, and that the little horn was already at work. The spirit of lawlessness was already at work during his lifetime. It doesn't say anything about separating it by 2,000 years. And also the one who was restraining him, you'd have to consider there needs to be someone there in order to restrain. So Paul is already is talking about someone who is already at work, so someone who was already present in his lifetime. Now it says that he would sit in the temple of God, making himself above God, and all those verses. Now, rather, some people see that as he is a stranger who comes into the temple of God, the church. Some people see it as he was already established in the temple of God, but abusing his power, abusing his situation. So, if when we consider these aspects, it could be that the little horn is Jewish in nature. Now, we're not talking about a Jewish person necessarily, or an individual person, but the Jewish in nature and the spirit of lawlessness already at work, because then it talks about he will be present until the day of the Lord. All right, something else to consider would be the phrase time, times, and half a time. That's in Daniel 7. We also see it in Daniel chapter 12. That's in verse 7. Now, Daniel chapter 12 goes on to talk about the abomination of desolation that would be set up. It also goes on to talk about the end of days. Now, if you go by the Olivet Discourse, the abomination of desolation refers, in Luke's version, to Jerusalem being surrounded by armies. The abomination, I think, caused by the religious leaders, left the temple in a state of desolation because it was ruined from what it was meant to be, which is a house of prayer. So then the desolation comes in by the Romans. Now, we also know that the power of the holy people shattered would also refer to 70 AD, because Jesus says the end of the age. He doesn't say the end of the world here. So the end of the old covenant age could be what Daniel is referring to here. Now, if the times, time, and half a time refers to 70 AD in this section, it would also make sense that it is also the same in chapter 7 of Daniel, that time, times, and half a time is referring to 70 AD as well. So the evidence seems to suggest that the little horn represents probably the abuse of the Jewish power at the time of Jesus, going into the time of Paul as well. And that the coming of the Lord represented him coming in judgment against Israel, in the same way that Yahweh comes in judgment against other nations in the Old Testament. All right, one more interpretation I want to share with you. Now, it is pretty much established by a lot of Christians that the four empires that are mentioned is Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and then the Roman Empire. Now, this there's the commentary underneath the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, and also this commentary here, Erdman's whole commentary on the Bible. They say there is another interpretation. This one is actually a little bit more traditional, in that instead of Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, they see it as Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece. So they do not see Rome there at all. And then what they claim is that after the rise of those empires, the little horn then would refer specifically to Antiochus Epiphanes, when the book of Daniel was written during the Maccabean revolt. Certainly the Maccabean revolt events were in the mind of the author, and we know that Antiochus Epiphanes sacrificed a pig, according to the book of Maccabees, on the altar of the temple, and that abomination of desolation, which is what it's referring to in Daniel, actually shut the temple down for 3 years or 3.5 years, which coincidentally, where do we see 3.5 years in the text? Time, times, and half a time. Now, even when you go on Wikipedia, actually, the first thing that comes up, I've noticed, is not so much the Antichrist, but Antiochus Epiphanes. And also, they see the horn, which is just called a small horn, I believe, in Daniel 8, as also Antiochus Epiphanes, because we know that the ram and the goat is Persia, Greece, and he would come after that reign. So that is another way to look at that. I suppose, would he fulfill all the criteria we've already looked at in the descriptions of the little horn, persecuting the saints, blasphemies against the Most High? Yeah, you could probably say that he was a significant figure, and it would probably be a very significant event to include him in a prophetic way in the book of Daniel. Well, thanks everyone for watching this little series. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's a really hard piece of scripture. It's not like just reading the book of Exodus or Genesis or something like that. Not that any of those are easy as well, but I think the thing that I come back to more than anything with all of this stuff from Daniel is that empires of wickedness and evil may come and go. They may get ever so powerful, persecute the saints, but evil does not win history, is I think the message here, and that Jesus comes down as the rock to destroy the forces of evil. And that doesn't mean that evil will stop. People will still get hurt. Evil will still reign. But we know what their destination is. I mean, in Revelation 20, all those who did not follow the Lamb were thrown into the lake of fire. That image there of John telling his audience to have faith, to have hope, that their hope in Christ is secure, that evil does not win history. And in fact, ever since the resurrection, evil's days are numbered because no evil goes on forever. The victory of Christ will always win. It will always tear down any empire, even whenever empires are ruling right now. So that's what we can take away from this message. Do not get disheartened by the powers of empire in the world, because they may get ever so powerful, but evil does not win history. Christ, in his kingdom, wins the battle, the fight, because the kingdom is within us. We spread his good news. We demonstrate Christ's way of living rather than the ways of the empire. So thank you, everyone. Please leave some comments. Please subscribe if you haven't yet. And I hope this little series has helped you. Bye.